Knowing which Pokemon to power up in Pokemon Go can be very difficult, so in this video I will be going through the best Pokemon to power up for raid attacking for each type, including some budget options which are generally easier to obtain and easier to power up, and I'll go through how effective each type is so you know which ones to power up first. I'll also be picking out some of the best Pokemon for the Great, Ultra and Master Leagues. So starting with raid attacking, for the fighting type which is strong against normal, rock, ice, steel and dark types, this is one of the more useful types in Pokemon Go in my opinion, because it can cover a good range of raid bosses, and I find myself using the fighting type team quite often. It's also worth having a good fighting type team if you're somebody who does a lot of gym battling, because it will be a good way to take out all those Blissies. With S tier being the best and C tier being the worst, I would place the fighting type in A tier. So for the best Pokemon of the fighting type, it is worth noting that the order I say them in is in descending order of how good they are. So the best Megas for the fighting type currently are Mega Heracross and Mega Blaziken. Mega Blaziken has a slightly higher damage per second, but Mega Heracross has a higher total damage output, so it has a higher rating overall. The best non-Mega fighting type attackers will be Terrakion, Keldeo, Shadow Machamp, Shadow Hariyama, Lucario, Conkeldurr, Shadow Blaziken and Shadow Regigigas. And if you can't afford to power up any of these Pokemon I've mentioned, some budget picks to consider could be Machamp, with Machop being a common spawn, even Shadow Machamp because Shadow Machop is usually available from the fighting type Rocket Grunt, and it is currently available from Rocket Leader Cliff as well. Lucario is also another good budget pick because Riolu has had quite a lot of boosted events, so you most likely have a decent amount of candy for it. It's also worth noting that Lucario with Power Up Punch is particularly strong for stun locking Giovanni as well, and for taking down Giovanni's Persian. You could also go for Hariyama, Breloom and Blaziken, with all of the pre-evolved forms being pretty common spawns. So when preparing for the future, some strong fighting types that will come to the game include Shadow Conkeldurr, Shadow and Mega Lucario, Mega Mewtwo X, Mega Gallade, Urshifu in its 2 regular forms and Gigantamax forms whenever they get added, Gigantamax Machamp, Keldeo in its Resolute form, Marshadow which is coming during Pokemon Go Fest later on this year. If the Ultra Beasts ever get Shadow forms, Shadow Pheromosa is a good one that will have really high DPS. We also see Pokemon like Slitherwing, Iron Hands, Great Tusk, Iron Valiant and Koraidon, but I imagine these ones are a little bit further off from release. So moving on to the Dark type, which is strong against Psychic and Ghost types. This is generally a very useful type because the 2 types that it works best against, it does also resist those attacks as well, so it can stay alive longer in the fight and do more damage. I would say that the Dark type is A tier in terms of usage. So the best Mega options for Dark types are Mega Tyranitar, followed by Mega Houndoom, Mega Gyarados and then Mega Absol. And for non-Mega Dark type Pokemon, we've got Shadow Tyranitar, Regular Tyranitar, Hydreigon, Shadow Weavile, Darkrai, Shadow Honchkrow, Yveltal and Shadow Houndoom. For budget picks, I would consider Tyranitar in its regular form. Larvitar has been featured in Community Day and it's generally available in eggs. Regular Tyranitar also happens to be one of the best Dark types. Hydreigon is a great option as well, with Dino having had a Community Day. You could also go for Incineroar, Weavile, Zoroark and Honchkrow. The lower stage evolutions for these Pokemon are generally quite common in the wild. So future Dark type attackers of note are Mega Sharpedo, Shadow Darkrai, Shadow Hydreigon, Shadow Yveltal, Ash Greninja, Shadow Incineroar, Grimmsnarl, Urshifu Single Strike and in its Gigantamax form, Kingambit, Brute Bonnet, Iron Jugulus, Roaring Moon, Chi-Yu and Chien-Pao. So for the Psychic type, which is strong against fighting and poison types, it does contain some of the highest DPS Pokemon in the game, but generally it's not that useful as a type, it's quite situational. I don't feel like Psychic type really comes up that often in the counter lists, so I would say it is B tier. So the best Mega Psychic types are Mega Alakazam, Mega Latios and Mega Gardevoir. Mega Gardevoir also doubles up as the best Fairy type Mega, so definitely a good one to invest in. For the best non-Mega Psychic types, we have Shadow Mewtwo, which is actually the best Psychic type attacker currently in the game. We also have Regular Mewtwo, Shadow Latios, Hoopa Unbound, Shadow Metagross, Shadow Alakazam, Lunala and Shadow Exeggutor. And if you can't afford many of these Pokemon, some budget picks are Metagross, which has had a Community Day in the past and it is likely to get a Community Day Classic fairly soon. You could also go for Espeon, Alakazam, Exeggutor, Gallade and Gardevoir. For the future, some Psychic types to look out for are Mega Mewtwo X and Mega Mewtwo Y. These two are most likely going to be the best Psychic type attackers for a while. There is also Mega Gallade, Mega Metagross, Necrozma, which is coming up for GoFest this year. This Pokemon also has fused forms Dawnwing and Duskmane Necrozma, and there is also Ultra Necrozma. There is also Calyrex Ice Rider and Shadow Rider, Iron Leaves, Iron Crown, Iron Boulder, and Monkey Dory. So moving on to the Poison type, it is strong against Grass and Fairy types, but generally it doesn't see a lot of play in the raiding meta because Fire types are generally going to be high DPS to go against Grass types, and Steel types are generally going to be better going strong against fairy types. I would say poison is C tier, it's not really a high priority type to build. But if you are looking to build a team of psychic type Pokemon, or at least power up some of the best options, the best mega options for the poison type are Mega Gengar and Mega Beedrill. For non-mega poison type attackers, we have Nihilego, Naganadel, which is releasing this season, Shadow Toxicroak, Roserade, Shadow Victory Bell, Shadow Vileplume, Overquill, and Shadow Alolan Muck. And for budget picks, I would recommend powering up Mega Beedrill because you do get Mega Energy for Beedrill, rarely from spinning gyms, so it's likely that you've got enough Mega Energy to evolve it. Other options could be Roserade, Overquill, Toxicroak, and Victory Bell, with Bellsprout having a community day in April, so a good time to get some Victory Bell. For the future of poison types that could be useful, we have Shadow Roserade, Shadow Overquill, Shadow Nihilego, and Shadow Naganadel if they do decide to do Shadow Ultra Beasts. Toxicity is another good one to look at, which does have a Gigantamax form as well. Also Eternatus, which is likely to impact the poison meta quite a bit alongside its Eternamax form. And from Gen 9 we have Iron Moth, Okidogi, Munkidori, and Fezandipiti. So moving on to the ground type that is strong against poison, rock, steel, fire, and electric type Pokemon. This type is very useful, it can hit a big range of types for super effective damage. It's also the only type that can hit electric type Pokemon for super effective damage as well, and there are generally a lot of really high DPS ground type attackers in the game. I would say this is one of the best types in the game, so I would put it at high A tier or even S tier. The best Mega and Primal ground types are Primal Groudon, Mega Garchomp, and Mega Swampert. For non-Mega ground types, the best are Shadow Groudon, Shadow Garchomp, Shadow Excadrill, Groudon, Landorus Therian form, Shadow Mamoswine, Shadow Rhyperior, and Garchomp. Some budget picks for the ground type are Garchomp, which has had a community day, so you might have some good Garchomp that you could power up. Other budget options include Excadrill, which is a strong steel type attacker as well. Also Mamoswine, which is also a strong ice type attacker. We also have Rhyperior and Rhydon, which are also good options, and they are both strong rock type attackers as well. Rhyhorn has also been featured in community day in the past, and it's generally quite a common spawn. For unreleased ground types that could have an impact on the meta, we have Incarnate Landorus with Sansear Storm, like the Therian form has recently received. Also, both the Incarnate and Therian versions of Landorus could have shadow forms, which would be some of the best ground type attackers. We also do have one ground type Mega that is yet to come to the game, which is Mega Camerupt, and we also have Sandy Shocks, Iron Treads, and Great Tusk coming in the future. Next we have the bug type that is strong against Psychic, Dark, and Grass type attacks, and generally this is one of the weaker types in the game. It doesn't see a lot of use because most of the time there is something better that can be used in its place for the types that it beats. This is a low priority type to build a team of, so I would say it's C tier. The best Mega bug types are Mega Heracross and Mega Pinsir. For non-Mega Pokemon, the best would be Pheromosa, Volcarona, Shadow Pinsir, Shadow Scizor, Genesect, Vikavolt, Yanmega, and Shadow Scyther. For budget picks, again I would go for Mega Beedrill because you do get its Mega Energy from spinning gyms. Also Vikavolt, Yanmega, Escavalier, Pinsir, Scizor, and Scyther are all decent picks that are fairly easy to get, especially as you can evolve into Escavalier for free if you mirror trade Carablast. And looking to the future for unreleased bug types, there are some shadows that would be particularly strong: Shadow Volcarona, Shadow Pheromosa, Shadow Genesect, and Shadow Vikavolt. New Pokemon like Centiskorch, Frostmoth, and Slitherwing are also good ones to look out for the future. Moving on to the grass type, which is strong against water, ground, and rock types. This type is generally a lower tier type that isn't really used that much, but it is worth having a couple of the top grass type attackers for certain situations. I would give this type a C tier, it's a pretty low priority type to go after. The best megas for the grass type are Mega Sceptile and Mega Venusaur, and for the best non-mega grass types we have Kartana, Shaymin Skyform, Zarude, Shadow Tangrowth, Shadow Torterra, Shadow Venusaur, Shadow Sceptile, and Shadow Exeggutor. And for some budget picks, I would recommend powering up Roserade, Chestnut, Decidueye, Meowscarada, Serena, and Tangrowth. Chespin and Rowlet have had community days, but it is worth noting that some of these community day Pokemon, like Chestnut and Decidueye, do want Legacy move Frenzy Plant to be at their best, which you would need to use an Elite TM for. But I would recommend using Elite TMs on higher priority Pokemon, so you could just go for other similar movesets of the type. For unreleased grass types to look out for in the future, we have Shadow Kartana, Shadow Roserade, Shadow Chestnut, Shadow Decidueye and Shadow Hisuian Decidueye, and Shadow Tapu Bulu. Also there is Rillaboom and Meowscarada with community day move Frenzy Plant. Rillaboom also has a Gigantamax form. There is also Brute Bonnet, Iron Leaves, and Ogerpon. For the fire type that is strong against bug, grass, ice, and steel types, this is actually a pretty decent type because there are a lot of high damage Pokemon that are fire types, but it is fairly situational and I don't find myself using them that often. I would put this type at B tier for its usability. The top mega fire types are Mega Charizard Y and Mega Blaziken. Mega Blaziken does have higher DPS, but Mega Charizard Y has a higher TDO and it's ranked slightly higher because of that. The best non-mega fire types to power up are Reshiram, Shadow Darmanitan, Shadow Entei, Shadow Ho-Oh, Shadow Moltres, Shadow Blaziken, Shadow Chandelure, and Heatran. But for budget picks, if you can't afford to power up any of those more expensive ones, I would recommend going for Darmanitan, Chandelure, Blaziken, Delphox, Emboar, and Incineroar. 4 of these, however, do want Elite TM move Blast Burn to be at their best, but you could use a different fire type moveset or other budget picks like Flareon and Arcanine if you can't get Blast Burn. Mega Houndoom I would also consider as a budget fire type as well, because it only requires 100 Mega Energy to Mega Evolve, and often you can get this energy from doing field research tasks depending on the season, and Houndour is generally a common spawn. For future fire types to look out for, we have Shadow Reshiram, which will be a very strong fire type attacker, especially with Fusion Flare. We also have Shadow Heatran, Blacephalon, Darmanitan Zen Mode, Shadow Volcarona, Volcanion, Centiskorch, Gigantamax Charizard, Iron Moth, Chi-Yu, and Gouging Fire. So for the water types that are strong against rock, ground, and fire, this is a decent type with some really strong Pokemon at the top, but I would say it's not often the best type to go for in a lot of situations, so I would put this one at B tier. The best water type Primal and Megas are Primal Kyogre, Mega Swampert, Mega Blastoise, and Mega Gyarados. For non-Megas, we have Shadow Kyogre, Regular Kyogre, Shadow Swampert, Shadow Feraligatr, Shadow Empoleon, Shadow Gyarados, Crawdaunt, and Regular Greninja. For budget water types, I would recommend Greninja and Swampert, which have had community days. Kingler is also a pretty common Pokemon to get, and also Feraligatr and Samurott have had community days as well, and they're generally some good budget picks. Again, the ones that have community day moves do want Elite TMs for Hydro Cannon, but other movesets will work if you can't access them. Some future Pokemon to look out for are Shadow Greninja, Ash Greninja, Shadow Kingler, Shadow Samurott, Volcanion, Inteleon, which does have a Gigantamax form, Palafin Hero form, Mega Sharpedo, Urshifu Rapid Strike, Iron Bundle, and Walking Wake. Moving on to the electric type, which is strong against water and flying types, this type is generally quite useful because it covers 2 of the most common types in the game and it only has 1 weakness. I would give it a spot in A tier for these reasons. The best electric type Megas are Mega Manectric and Mega Ampharos. The best non-Mega electric types are Shadow Raikou, Xurkitree, Zekrom, Shadow Electivire, Shadow Zapdos, Thundurus Therian form, Shadow Magnezone, and Shadow Luxray. And for budget picks, I would recommend Electivire, Magnezone, Luxray, Vikavolt, and Pawmot. Most of these Pokemon are pretty common spawns and are generally quite accessible. Mega Manectric, being the best electric type Mega, is also fairly budget because it only requires 100 Mega Energy to evolve, so you might even be able to get that from field research tasks, and Electrike itself is pretty common. For unreleased electric types coming to the game at some point in the future, I would keep an eye out for Shadow Xurkitree, Shadow Zekrom, Shadow Therian Thundurus, Zeraora, Sandy Shocks, Iron Hands, Iron Thorns, Raging Bolt, and Miraidon. For the best dragon types, which are strong against other dragon types only, generally you could use ice and fairy types to take out dragons instead of using dragon types because they won't take super effective damage, but dragon types do have some of the highest damage in the game, so they will be the best options for fighting other dragons, especially if you are trying to beat the raid timer with few people. And there are a lot of dragon type legendary Pokemon, so I would put dragon type in A tier because of these reasons. The best dragon type Megas are Mega Rayquaza, Mega Garchomp, and Mega Salamence. The best non-Mega dragon types to power up are Shadow Salamence, Origin Form Palkia, Shadow Garchomp, Shadow Dragonite, Origin Form Dialga, Shadow Latios, Rayquaza, and Palkia. And for budget picks, it is worth powering up Salamence, Garchomp, Dragonite, Haxorus, and Hydreigon. All of these have had community days in the past and have been included in quite a lot of events, so hopefully you do have some candy to power up some of these Pokemon if you don't have any of the more expensive picks. For the future, it is worth considering Shadow Rayquaza, Shadow Origin Dialga and Palkia, Shadow Regular Dialga and Palkia, Shadow Zekrom and Shadow Reshiram, Shadow Baxcalibur, Eternatus and its Eternamax form, Black and White Kyurem, Dragapult, Roaring Moon, Miraidon and Koraidon, Walking Wake, Archaludon, Gouging Fire, and Raging Bolt. Moving on to the Fairy type, which is strong against Dragon, Dark, and Fighting types. This type is pretty useful with the amount of Dragon type legendary raid bosses, because while generally this type is out DPS'd by Dragon type counters, it will resist Dragon, allowing them to stay alive longer, so it could be a good option. However, I would put this type at B tier because there aren't really a lot of Fairy types that do high damage. For the best Mega Fairy type, you want to go for Mega Gardevoir. For non-Mega Fairy types, the best options to power up are Enamorus, Shadow Gardevoir, Xerneas, Shadow Gramble, Togekiss, Gardevoir, Sylveon, and Shadow Donphan. And for budget picks, if you can't afford any of these more expensive ones, I would recommend Togekiss, Gardevoir, Sylveon, Primarina, Granbull, and Florges. Some of these have had community days in the past, and they are generally pretty common spawns, so worth picking up if you can't power up some of the more expensive ones. For the future, these are the Fairy type Pokemon to look out for: Shadow Shadow Enamorus, Enamorus in its Therian form, Mega Mawile and Mega Ordino, although these Megas aren't really going to be better than Mega Gardevoir. We also have Hatterene, Zacian in its Crown form, Fluttermane, Iron Valiant and Fezandipiti. For the flying type that is strong against bug, grass and fighting types, this type doesn't really see a lot of use. Probably because there aren't a lot of legendary raid bosses that fall under these types that it is good against, and there are often some other better options. But there are some really high damage flying types that I will go through. I would put this type in C tier, being a low priority team to build. The best flying type Megas are Mega Rayquaza and Mega Pidgeot. Mega Rayquaza has the highest damage in the game, so it's well worth investing in, even though flying types aren't that meta because it is super strong and it is often a top count of a Pokemon that it doesn't even deal super effective damage against because it can deal so much neutral damage. For non-Mega flying types, the best are Rayquaza, Shadow Moltres, Yveltal, Shadow Staraptor, Shadow Ho-Oh, Shadow Honchkrow, Moltres and Shadow Unpheasant. And for budget picks, I recommend Staraptor, both Braviary, Honchkrow and possibly Mega Pidgeot, which does only require 100 Mega Energy to Mega Evolve, and often you can find its Mega Energy in field research depending on the season. And for future flying types, we do have Shadow Rayquaza, which should be part of the next Team Go Rocket takeover, with the last two being Shadow Kyogre and Shadow Groudon. We've also got Shadow Yveltal in the future with Oblivion Wing in particular. Shadow Tornadus as well as Shadow Braviary could be pretty strong. Also Kilowattrel, Flamigo and Iron Jugulis. Moving on to the Rock type, which is strong against Flying, Bug, Fire and Ice type Pokemon. This is actually one of the most useful types in the game. There are a lot of Flying type legendaries and some that are Fire Flying where Rock is even more effective. Raid bosses like Moltres and Ho-Oh for example. And generally I tend to use this type quite often. I would put this type at S tier. It's definitely worth having a Rock type raid team. The best Rock type Megas to power up will be Mega Diancie, Mega Tyranitar and Mega Aerodactyl. For non-Mega Rock types we have Shadow Rhyperior, Shadow Rampardos, Shadow Tyranitar, Rhyperior, Rampardos, Tyrantrum and Terrakion. And for budget picks, I would recommend powering up Rhyperior, which has had a community day, but you do need Rock Wrecker for it to be at its best. But if you can't get that, Stone Edge will do. Rampardos is another good pick. It's fairly rare, but it has been featured in a few events before. Tyrantrum is also another good one to power up. Also, you could power up Gigalith, which has had a community day, and Roggenrola is a fairly common spawn. And lastly, Tyranitar is a good option too. For unreleased Rock types to look out for, we have Shadow Tyrantrum, Shadow Gigalith, Shadow Terrakion, Glimmora, Iron Thorns, Ogerpon, and Iron Boulder. When it comes to the Ghost type that is strong against Psychic and Ghost, this type does contain some really high damage Pokemon like Mega Gengar, but generally against Ghost and Psychic you are going to want to go for Dark types because they resist both Psychic and Ghost type attacks. So I don't think Ghost is really that important to build. I would put this type in B tier. The best Mega Ghost types to power up will be Mega Gengar and Mega Banette. For non-Mega Ghost types you could power up Shadow Chandelure, Shadow Gengar, Giratina Origin Form, Goldengo, Chandelure, Gengar, Hooper Confined and Hooper Unbound. But for budget picks I would recommend Chandelure, which is one of the best Ghost types even without being in its Shadow form, and it has had a community day. Gengar is also a great budget Ghost type because Ghastly is a pretty common spawn. Also Hisuian Typhlosion because it has had a raid day and it is available in 3-star raids every now and again. Trevenant might also be worth going for because trading Phantom does bring its evolution cost down to 0, making it a good budget pick. Banette is also a good budget pick because Shuppet is pretty common and it only takes 100 Mega Energy to Mega Evolve Banette for the first time. Looking to the future of Ghost types, we've got Shadow Giratina, which might not be too far off. Also Shadow Goldengo if this gets released. Also potentially Shadow Hooper, Shadow Hisuian Typhlosion, Blacephalon, which could be being released this season. Also Dragapult, Cursula, Poltegeist, Delmise, Hisuian Zoroark, Spectria, Shadow Rider Calyrax, Fluttermane, Poltergeist, Sinistcha, and Petulant. Moving on to the Ice type, which is strong against Dragon, Ground, Grass, and Flying type Pokemon. This type I do find to be one of the more useful types. There are a lot of Flying and Dragon type legendary raid bosses in general, so I find myself using Ice types quite often. But there aren't a lot of high damage Ice types, so other types are often used over the Ice types. But having said that, I would still put it at A tier. The best Mega Ice types would be Mega Glalie and Mega Abomasnow. For non-Mega Ice types you could power up Shadow Mamoswine, which does happen to be the best Ice type attacker currently. We also have Shadow Weavile, Baxcalibur, Galarian Darmanitan, Mamoswine, Glaceon, Cetitan and Weavile. For budget picks for the Ice type I would recommend powering up Mamoswine, with Swinub being pretty common. Also Glaceon and Weavile are good because Eevee and Sneasel are fairly common as well. For unreleased Ice type attackers to look out for in the future, we have Shadow Galarian Darmanitan, Shadow Glaceon, Jolteon, Zen Mode Galarian Darmanitan, Shadow Baxcalibur, Shadow Cetitan, Black and White Kyurem, Glastria, Ice Rider Calyrex, Iron Bundle, and Chien-Pao. And lastly, for the Steel type, which is strong against Fairy, Ground, and Rock, this type is very good for taking out Fairy types. It's usually the choice for taking out Fairy types over Poison types, but other than that, Steel doesn't have a lot of use. I would put this type at B tier. The best Steel type Megas are Mega Aggron and Mega Scizor, and for the best non-Mega Steel types to power up, we have Shadow Metagross, Regular Metagross, Shadow Excadrill, Dialga, Origin Dialga, Genesect, Shadow Scizor, and Excadrill. For budget picks, I would recommend Metagross, although Beldum is fairly rare. It has had a community day in the past, and it will most likely have a community day classic sometime soon. Excadrill is another decent budget pick, and alongside Metagross, these are the two best budget picks for Steel, but you could also go for Bisharp and Scizor as well. For future Steel types with potential, we have Mega Metagross, which will be the best Steel type attacker. We also have Mega Lucario, Necrozma Duskmane, Magearna, Duraludon, Zacian, and Zamazenta in their Crown forms, King Gambit, Iron Treads, Archaladon, and Iron Crown. So that's it for the Pokemon to power up as raid attackers. Let's go through some of the best Pokemon in each of the main Go Battle leagues. It's worth noting that for this section, any move with an asterisk next to it indicates a legacy move that requires an Elite TM to get. So starting off with the Great League, the top 12 Pokemon in the current meta are Registeel with Lock-On, Focus Blast, and Zap Cannon, Annihilate with Counter, Night Slash, and Shadow Ball, Cresselia with Psycho Cut, Grass Knot, and Future Sight, Shadow Gligar with Wing Attack, Aerial Ace, and Dig. Next we have Lickitung with Lick, Body Slam, and Power Whip, Carbink with Rock Throw, Rock Slide, Moonblast, Shadow Quagsire with Mud Shot, Aqua Tail, and Stone Edge, Shadow Swampert with Mud Shot, Hydro Cannon, and Earthquake, Shadow Feraligatr with Shadow Claw, Hydro Cannon, and Ice Beam, Mandibuzz with Snarl, Dark Pulse, and Aerial Ace, Skarmory with Steel Wing, Brave Bird, and Sky Attack, and Swampert with Mud Shot, Hydro Cannon, and Earthquake. For the Ultra League, the top 12 Pokemon are Registeel with Lock-On, Focus Blast, and Zap Cannon, Shadow Feraligatr with Shadow Claw, Hydro Cannon, and Ice Beam, Giratina in its altered form with Shadow Claw, Dragon Claw, and Shadow Sneak, Poliwrath with Counter, Icy Wind, and Scald, Feraligatr with Shadow Claw, Hydro Cannon, and Ice Beam, Zygarde in its complete form with Dragon Tail, Crunch, and Earthquake, Pidgeot with Wing Attack, Feather Dance, and Brave Bird, Cresselia with Psycho Cut, Grass Knot, and Moonblast, Shadow Poliwrath with Counter, Icy Wind, and Scald, Mandibuzz with Snarl, Dark Pulse, and Aerial Ace, Shadow Registeel with Lock-On, Focus Blast, and Zap Cannon, and lastly Virizion with Double Kick, Leaf Blade, and Sacred Sword. For the Master League, I will go through the current top Pokemon, and I'll also go through some budget picks because they can be quite expensive to power up. So firstly, we have Origin Palkia with Dragon Breath, Aqua Tail, and Spatial Rend. We have Zygarde complete form with Dragon Tail, Crunch, and Earthquake, Landorus in its Therian form with Mudshot, Sandsear Storm, and Stone Edge, Dragonite with Dragon Breath, Dragon Claw, and Superpower, Giratina in its altered form with Shadow Claw, Dragon Claw, and Ancient Power, Palkia with Dragon Breath, Aqua Tail, and Draco Meteor, Groudon with Mudshot, Precipice Blades, and Fire Punch, Solgaleo with Fire Spin, Psychic Fangs, and Iron Head, Shadow Dragonite with Dragon Breath, Dragon Claw, and Superpower, Kyurem with Dragon Breath, Glaciate, and Dragon Claw, Giratina Origin with Shadow Claw, Shadow Ball, and Ominous Wind, and Meloetta Aria with Quick Attack, Psyshock, and Dazzling Gleam. For budget picks, I would recommend going for Dragonite because it has had 2 community days and Dratini is generally one of the more common dragon types. You could also go for Hisui and Avalugg, which is decent because it's sometimes in 3-star raids which are an easy solo. Goodra is another good option, with Gumi most likely having a community day in June. We also have Gyarados, which is a strong Pokemon, and Magikarp is a common spawn, so this one should be pretty easy to build. Florges is another highlight for budget picks, with Flabebe being a fairly common spawn, and it has also been featured in quite a lot of events recently. You could also build Mamoswine for Master League because Swinub is a pretty common spawn, and this one can double up as an ice and ground type attacker. Ursaluna could be a good budget pick because Teddy Ursa has had a community day, and again it does spawn often here and there, but you do need the full moon to evolve Ursaring into Ursaluna, so bear that in mind. Garchomp is an option because Gible has had a community day and it has been featured in quite a few events. Again, this can double up as a strong dragon and ground type raid attacker as well. Swampert is definitely worth building because Mudkip is a fairly common spawn and it has been featured in community day in the past, so you might have a good amount of candy for it. I would also consider Hydreigon. It's also a good budget dragon type and a decent dark type raid attacker as well. And you could go for Melmetal, which is one of the easiest Pokemon to power up because you can get many Meltan from the Meltan mystery box, which you can use every 3 days by sending a Pokemon to Pokemon Home or to Let's Go Pikachu or Let's Go Eevee. I'll have a video linked in the description of how to do that if you're interested. And lastly, I would recommend keeping an eye on pvpoke.com to see the best Pokemon and team as the meta evolves and changes changes, particularly at the start of a season where there are a lot of move additions and rebalancing. So if you want to know which Team Rocket members give you the strongest Pokemon and which field research give you the strongest Pokemon, you should check out these videos next.